So, first off, I want to say welcome to Gina. She is new. So, it's nice to have you with us. I'm excited to have you as part of the group. Hi, Tavi.
Hello.
How are you, my dear? Feeling better, I hope?
A little bit.
Good.
Yeah, things have calmed down a little bit over the last week, so I finally got a chance to just sit down, relax, and work on writing today. So
Fantastic. I'm glad to hear it. And I'm glad that you're doing okay after what happened last week.
yeah.
All right. So, picking up on our thread, because doing things in order is for losers, we did Act 2 2 weeks ago. Last week we did Act 1, and this week we're doing Act 3. So if you want to do it in order, well, you can watch the videos in order on YouTube. However, I am a lawless wasteland when it comes to numbers, so here we go. Am I actually quiet? I say. I don't know if I can change that. Alright, let's go with that. I just upped my volume. So, that gets to go in the video. Everyone gets to see my Discord settings. So, is that better? A little bit louder? Alright. I'm hoping at some point to get a new headset, but eventually. So, the third act. It is the exciting climax of your book. It is the last hurrah. It is the last segment. It is the exciting part, too, in a lot of the cases, because you're writing the final confrontation between your main character and the antagonists, and we're coming right up into the end. So, after getting through Act 2, which is a long slog, Act 3 can feel, yes, our battle will be legendary. Act 3 can suddenly feel like either a breath of fresh air, or people tend to rush it because they're sick of writing the full thing and want to be done already. Those are the two possibilities here. Because if you haven't been really careful about your Act 2, writing for that midpoint, and then from the midpoint, writing on towards the Act 3 here, you're probably going to be feeling like, well, now what? Also, if you have opened more doors than you have shut and haven't made any of the pieces connect yet, you're going to start running into problems in Act 3. So, referring back to our handy dandy beat sheet that we always use here, the Act 3 starts with something to pull the character out of the end of Act 2's dark night of the soul, which is usually the moment when the main character or main characters feel like the world has ended, everything has gone wrong, and nothing will ever be good again. Act 3 starts with some kind of reinvigoration of the character of the story. Maybe help comes from an unexpected source, or they come up with a new plan, or they get some new information, but one way or another, something happens to pull them out of that dark night of the soul and into the ending. So, drawing on the fact that I spent all day nerding out about Avatar The Last Airbender, if you look at the first season, we're not going to talk about the whole series right now because it would be too much, but the first season, the Dark Night of the Soul really happens around episode 17 called The Storm, which is, for those of you who've seen the show, when Aang has to come to the horrible conclusion that his abdication of responsibility and subsequent going in the ice for 100 years has been somewhat directly responsible for the fact that the Fire Nation has done what the Fire Nation has done. So he's in this really deep, dark place. He's been fighting with Sokka, Sokka and Katara pretty badly. You had that episode where Sokka, there's this message that's supposed to come to Sokka and Katara from their dad that Aang doesn't deliver, and so they part ways for that episode. There's been a lot of infighting through there. Things are really tense. They finally get to the northern air tribes city. And that's the beginning of Act 3, because at that point, Aang has finally gotten to the location that he started off in episode 2 trying to get to. So it took all these episodes to get to this location. and he's finally arrived. He's finally getting the waterbending mastery teaching. So he and Katara are getting their learn on, so to speak, and so he's finally kind of breaking through this period in the season where he's been stuck, kind of ruminating on nothing but his failures and dealing with the ramifications of ruminating on his failures for the rest of that big chunk of space. Um, so that's the break into 3 for season 1 of Avatar: The Last Airbender. That is an example of how you choose to do it in a number of in Full Moon. If anybody here's a Harry Dresden fan, in Dresden Files, the second book, Full Moon, you start entering into the third act when Harry decides that he's going to go to the compound and set up the trap for the uh, not the Loop Guru, but the FBI who has the belt. Spoiler alert, I'm sorry, but the book's been out for a really long time, so if you haven't read it yet and has spoiled something, apologies, but it's like spoilering Star Wars at this point. Um, so, but that's kind of the level of the character comes up with an idea or comes up with some kind of new angle on how to attack the main conflict. Motorcycles, apparently. So this new angle of attack provides some injection of more forward momentum and more energy into the story, which in the end, which after the midpoint has kind of been sort of circling this experience the main characters are having of hopelessness, despair, and not knowing what to do next. So you're breaking them out of that by giving them some kind of impetus to move forward. So looking at the beat sheet, unlike the previous acts, Act 3 only has 3 pieces: break into 3, finale, and ending image. So, by contrast to the rest of them, Act 3 goes by in a flash. In a lot of books, it's a matter of 2-3 chapters, if that. So your conclusion, it doesn't need to be, you don't need to think of this in terms of it's a full third of the book, because as we've gone over, with the second act being about half the story, the first act might actually be longer than the third act. So it's not like 3 equally divided pieces, but the third act, it's typically pretty short. Because you've built all this tension to fever pitch through your second act, and you're now, at this point, hitting that point where you need to pay that off. If you don't pay it off, your readers will feel like they wasted their time, which is probably the worst thing you can do to somebody who has spent 8 or more hours reading your book. If they walk away from having read your book feeling like they've wasted their time, it's going to be a sad day. And it's not going to be a good day for you. Nobody's going home happy. So you want to make sure you pay off their diligence and their enjoyment and their participation in your reading the story. So you have this climactic scene, this battle where you pull all of those threads that you've been kind of unraveling through the story, or those doors that you've been opening. All of those pieces should come together in the end here. So in my blog that's coming out Monday, I use the example of the big climactic battle against Thanos in Avengers Endgame. I'm not going to give you any spoilers here. Again, I guess if you haven't seen it by now, but I'm not going to spoiler you. That said, a lot of characters come back into the battle, and you see people that were spoiler. The Avengers are, yeah, exactly. That actually is kind of a spoiler. The Avengers are in it. So, but a lot of characters who were gone by the wayside or hadn't been around for the movie or hadn't been around recently or who'd been going through stuff, you see all these people show up and you have just this moment of, yes, it's you, where did you go? There are these moments when characters return and you get this feeling of satisfaction and excitement because, oh, that character's been gone a while, you're happy to see them again, and you get really excited about the characters entering on the scene. Or if you're in a detective novel, in this third act, your main character, your detective, should be hunting down the bad guy. They should have all the pieces, and they're like, okay, he's going to be at this place at this time. So it was, what, Dr. Plum in the library with the wrench. They know it's all these things. They now have to get there and end the story. Right, exactly, Anagram. Um, so, sorry, I clicked the spoiler. Anybody who's watching the video, now you get to see it forever. My bad. So, there's that. And so you have those moments, those kind of like, that should be what your climax is about. Now, it doesn't always have to feel good. The climax of the story could be your character losing terribly. I prefer happy endings, so I like to have my characters win in the end. It makes me feel good because there are too many places in life where people lose awfully who shouldn't. So I don't like to write sad endings, but all respect to people who do. That's a stylistic choice, not a one is superior than the other. So you have this, but in the sense that you have this climactic scene where you're writing all of these things coming together. It could be, it doesn't have to be action if your story isn't an action story. If it's a romance, the two main characters are finally getting together. They're finally meeting. You know, they've gotten through this rough patch in their relationship, and they're finally getting together to the wild cheering of everybody who's been with them this whole time. So it could be any number of different ways you can go about it, but this should be the really satisfying part of the book. That's like, all right, I've got, this is finally happening. We're here. Let's do the thing. And it's also the point in the book at which hope comes back, because you've taken pretty much all the hope away from the main characters. At least you should have, and if you didn't, bad. In the end of Act 2, and towards, with taking away their support, with taking away their positivity, with breaking up the main team, whatever it is you chose to do, you should have just kind of stripped hope out of their world and left them with that dark night of the soul, in which the amount of hope that they've got is at its lowest point. And then with the introduction of Act 3, you heading towards that climax, that's when you start being like, well, have a little hope. And then as it builds to the climax, they start getting more and more hopeful of their success. And then at the peak of this, they either succeed or are horribly crushed, I guess, if that's your thing. Or it could be a Pyrrhic victory. They succeed and then die. I don't know. There's no wrong or right way to do that, but at the same way, you should have that build of energy, and then like you should have that crescendo where it's payoff. It should feel like payoff from the rest of the book. If your character's going to fail horribly, that's okay, but it should still feel like payoff for the rest of the book. I mean, you could do that, Yuna, but if you're trying to write that ending, but make sure it's payoff for the readers. So, I didn't watch it, I didn't read it, but think what happened in Game of Thrones. You had all of this momentum building up to these things, and then at the end it just kind of, because everything that happened. No, it's not more of an intro to the second book. We'll talk about that. But in Game of Thrones, you had this build up to all these things happening, and then just, well, I guess that's how that ended. So you don't want to end up with a whoopee cushion of an ending here. You want your characters to, right, you can subvert expectations, and that's a great thing. Definitely subvert expectations. It doesn't have to come out the way readers think it's going to, but it has to be satisfying anyway. So the key here is to satisfy your readers. Even if the story's not over, even if this is the introduction into a series, or you're writing a book in a series, the primary plot of this book should be coming to a conclusion and should be satisfying to the reader. Even if they aren't happy, regardless of what emotion they're feeling, it should, when this big climax is done, when we're getting to the ending image, when we're in the denouement, if you want to use the French, it should feel like closure. So that closure should be, it should feel right. If you're just, sorry about the tail, if you are just closing it off like, okay, well, I guess I'm done, and don't really satisfy the readers, you're going to have what happened in Game of Thrones happen to you. I mean, how many times have I watched a TV show and really enjoyed the TV show, but find out they bungled the last season of it because they ran out of funding, didn't realize it would be the last season, or didn't know how to close the show, or they were too afraid to own the directions they'd taken it previously and were like, oh, I guess we have to go back to what we did before. Dexter's a really good example of that. Um, so, yeah, you want to make sure that whatever it is, it ends it well, even if you're leaving the opening there for another book. That's the key too. If you're ending the story of the first book and leaving space for the second one, that's going to be more of a meta plot opening for the second one. And as I say in my blog, please, for all that is holy and unholy and smothered in mayonnaise or relish or whatever is on your hot dog, please, please do not use cliffhangers. Don't. I have seen them used well with extreme rarity. And for new authors who don't have an established relationship with their publisher and who aren't really experienced, it can be a death knell, because if you don't have another book guaranteed to come out, and it's not guaranteed to come out soon, you are going to wreck your reader base. And not in the fun way. I have seen, there are, in the Dresden Files, which I will nerd out about excessively, there are 2 books with cliffhangers in them. I'm not going to give too many details, but the book ends on a big, big cliffhanger, which leads into the next book in the series. And then the Peace Talks, which just came out, left off on a pretty significant cliffhanger. However, it was the first half of what is essentially the literary equivalent of a 2-part episode, because the book that he was writing got too big and he had to break it in half. One book came out 1 month, the next book came out like a month and a half, 2 months later. And since it's Jim Butcher, we knew he was going to be putting out the next book, because at this point, Jim is the literary equivalent of hotcakes. So those are some of the only examples I have of good cliffhangers. Cliffhangers don't even really work. They work okay in television when it's like, next week on this show, we're going to be seeing the second half of this 2-part episode, so end with a cliffhanger and we'll see what happens next week. That's fine. A week of pins and needles and suspense? Okay. Books sometimes take years to come out. So if you leave the reader feeling really unsatisfied with the cliffhanger ending, they're going to be feeling unsatisfied for up to years, and there's no guarantee you're going to put out the next book. Unless you have, unless you're Jim Butcher. Or you're self-publishing and are doing things your way. But there's no guarantees. So, until you've built up your readership, don't use them. Avoid them at all costs. They are garbage. And I would even say that to Jim Butcher, like, I'm not a fan of him having used cliffhanger endings, not because it left me on pins and needles, because I didn't start reading the series and discovering it until after changes had been published and I was able to just pick up the next book and read it. But I find cliffhangers to be just, it's weak writing most of the time. Like, if your story hasn't kept your reader's interest and hasn't hooked them in by the end of your book, then it's not going to. If you haven't made them want to buy your next book already with the rest of your book, giving them a cliffhanger isn't going to make them want to buy it. So it's shoddy. Now, you don't have to tie up your ending all nice and neat with little bows. You can have loose threads. You can have questions left unanswered. You can have all sorts of things that aren't explained and could lead into future books. That's fine. I encourage that. Particularly if you're writing a series. You don't need to answer every single question, but you need to at least close off the main plot and leave the reader ready for the characters to take the next step as a series writer. Okay, so the character, at the end of Fallen, the novel that I'm working on, my main character is going to probably, no spoilers because it hasn't been written yet, but she's gonna defeat the bad guy. I know, right? The world is ending. Here we go. I've just destroyed your interest in reading my book. My character's going to defeat the bad guy. But in doing so, they're going to learn that there's more than they thought associated with this bad guy, and in fact, the situation is bigger than they imagined. If that isn't cliche, I don't know what is, but it's a really common literary device, and fuck you, I'm using it. So, but that's an okay thing to do. But at that point, the story that has been the main character fighting against this antagonist for this whole book is going to be wrapped up, even if there are questions left unanswered, and the readers can be like, what? I wonder what's happening next. But it's not a cliffhanger because the main character is not, not literally hanging from the edge of a cliff when, next time on our grand adventure, maybe, in 2 years, we will see what happens to this character hanging off the edge of a cliff. Don't do that. So, right, exactly, Mel. The rabbit hole goes much deeper than anticipated, and oh no, here it comes. More tale. Excuse you. So, that kind of ending's fine. But the key is satisfying your readers. So, the third act is literally you take all the pieces all the doors you've opened, except for the ones you want to leave open, and just start closing them. If you've introduced an element to the story in the beginning and you haven't used it yet, now would be the time to use it. Or in editing, you might delete that element because Chekhov's gun, if you put that gun on the wall in the first act and never looked at it again and spent a lot of time describing this gun on the wall and never use it again, what's the point? It's time to start deleting it. So if you come across things, when you get to your third act and you're analyzing, okay, here's all the pieces, here's all my dominoes that I've set up, you're going to have to figure out how to push the dominoes and make them go forward. Another example of a finale that really stuck with me that I really love is V for Vendetta. I love that movie. I have strong feelings about that movie. It's a fantastic movie, and the music. Okay, so in the scene where it all kind of comes together, the beginning of the climactic end, you have Detective Finch describing what's going to happen. He's going to say, I was at Lark Hill. It was like I could see all these pieces laid out in front of me. And then his companion says, well, then you know what's coming next? And he's like, no, but I can guess. And he starts describing the exact tactics that V is going to use to accomplish his ends. And as he's describing this, you see V literally setting up dominoes. Like, they did such a beautiful job with the visuals, but as he's describing, somebody's going to do something stupid and it's going to start this whole thing. You're fine, Carl. Let's take your time. You're good. It's going to be recorded. It's going to be dominoes being set up. And you see, like, the camera shows V setting up the dominoes while Finch is talking, while cutting in scenes of what's actually happening. That is exactly what Finch is saying. This is what's going to happen, and it's inevitable at this point. And then this penultimate moment is when you see V flick that front domino, and they all just start falling. It's a really amazing scene. We are talking about the use of the third act, and right now I'm talking about the climax of the third act, the big, that moment. When, as I've been describing here in the scene about V for Vendetta, the dominoes start to fall. Even if you aren't really into the movie, even if it's not your thing, I strongly recommend watching it, if nothing else, to see that scene. Because that is a really good example of a finale moment. Because he literally shows you the dominoes he's been setting up. So, to continue along those lines, through your book, through Acts 1 and 2, mostly Act 2, if we're honest, you've been setting up these dominoes. These pieces. It is a great movie. You've been setting up all these little pieces everywhere. And in Act 3, as in for V for Vendetta, you should be flicking the front domino, and all those pieces should just kind of be in a neat, orderly pile because you've been setting them up. You know what's coming. Now, yes, there's a lot to be said for red herrings. You can absolutely use red herrings and have things, as Anagram suggested, subvert expectations. In fact, it's a really good way to get readers like that moment. Subvert expectations all you want. But make sure when you're subverting the expectations, you're doing it in a way that leaves the reader satisfied. Like, surprise them, confuse them. You can go the M. Night Shyamalan, oh, he was dead all along. You know, do that all you want. Right, that's... You're welcome. My husband's mad, now I spoiled Sixth Sense for him. Tragedy. Um, but you want to make sure that all of these set pieces are done in the right way, in the V for Vendetta way, not the Game of Thrones way, which just you flick the domino and then they just kind of exploded and things happen and you're like, I didn't see that coming. And when you have your readers saying, I didn't see that coming, you want them to be saying it in the really excited way, not the really way. So if you're going to do the expectation subversion, make sure it's in a manner that is going to feel good at the end of it. Right, or in the way of Lost, or somebody else brought up Dexter. My husband would bring up How I Met Your Mother at the end when they kind of led you one way for a large part of the series, then yanked you the other way, then went back to the first way because they didn't have the courage to close the show out the way it was supposed to be closed. But I'm sure we could all come up with examples in literature of times when people dropped the ball at the 11th hour and failed to make the field goal. Sports ball, not my specialty. Kicking, throwing, sports ball analogy. Right. So there's a good way and a bad way. That's exactly what I'm getting at. When you've got this subverting expectations, that's, oh, what a twist, for no reason whatsoever except you wrote yourself into a corner. That's when you're going to end up with readers going, I guess, and they aren't going to be excited about it. But when you've taken your ending here and you're subverting their expectations by grabbing things from the beginning and saying, oh, by the way, it was like this the entire time, and here's the instances and ways in which I told you it was like this. I didn't lie to you. I told you it was like this. You just didn't believe me until the end. So if we're going to use, Sixth Sense as an example, there are ways and places and times throughout that entire movie that make it obvious the main character is dead. However, until you see it said, you're like, I guess, you don't really pick up on them. But the minute you know he's dead, the minute you know that the main character's dead in Sixth Sense, you can think back over the rest of the movie and be like, oh no, oh, this makes sense now. So you've got this kind of pulling all the threads together in this mastery of puppetry kind of way, where your expectations have been subverted, and you've been surprised, but you can go back, and as Ellie points out, it gives a lot of rereadability. You can go back and see these pieces being set up, and you can see the foreshadowing being used. And then when the trigger's finally pulled, you're like, don't get me wrong, M. Night Shyamalan is not my favorite movie guy. Is he a producer, a director? What is he? Writer? I don't know. He's not my favorite movie thing. But he did that movie well, and there are in many instances where he did that as a good job. Right, Frodo refusing to destroy the ring. That's a really good example of it. So, you see it set up through the book that Frodo's not going to be able to part with that thing because he's addicted as hell to the One Ring, and it's kind of one of those circumstances where you can see it coming, but when it happens, you still have that moment of ooh. So, and that's common in video games and all kinds of other media like that. the subverting expectations thing is really big. Now, in certain genres, so like cozy mystery, for example, you don't want to subvert expectations too hard. You might be like, hey, it wasn't actually the guy that she's been chasing the whole time. It was the person who's been helping her chase the guy the whole time. I'm thinking of Murder, She Wrote, so that's why the main character's female in my brain. I have an unfortunate addiction to that show. I've tried reading some of the books, but the show is campy and fabulous and awful. I love it. Um, so you can subvert expectations even there, but it's more or less going to be kind of what you expected because that's that genre. In romance, a lot of the time, it is going to be what you expected. Even if it's not the way you expected it, it's going to be kind of what you expected because that romance play between the two characters, if they don't get together in the end, the reader is going to be like, well, what did I read this for? Unless you're writing it intentionally to have a unhappy ending, which is again okay. There's nothing wrong with it. You just need to go into it with intent, and I like happy endings, so that's how I'm gonna go every time. 10 out of 10. Right, like tragedies. Think Romeo and Juliet. Everybody dies, nobody's happy, and nobody's learned a dang thing. So the ending fits the story. It works. It's valuable, but I'm not going to enjoy it. But again, that's a personal taste thing. I respect them, and I understand that tragedy has its place and it's valuable. I'm not in any way trying to talk down about it. Um, so I've kind of. Is there anything else you guys want to go over with the third act? Because with the third act being pretty short, I'm just gonna mute you, and there we go. With the third act being pretty short, is there anything in particular you guys want to discuss about the third act and how to execute it well? I know I'm usually asking this a lot further in, but Act 3 is kind of not a huge topic in some ways. That's okay, Lyde. I record these, so you'll have the opportunity to see what you missed. Um, as a brief note, I do have the last 2 weeks up in the video history channel if anybody wants to watch them. Um, you do not have to raise the level of hope the entire time. You can chuck as many wrenches as you want. You can make them desperate, you can make them scared, but the return of hope is kind of the intro into Act 3. It doesn't need to be all hopeful and shiny and flowers the whole time. It can be gritty and awful and confusing and terrifying for most of it. That's completely acceptable. But there should at least be the faintest hope of success, because if they don't believe that they're. So they might think that if they, in their attempts to succeed, they're going to die. In their attempts to succeed, everything is going to go wrong. Right, you can definitely do that anagram. Definitely do like, here's a little hope, and now I punch you. Here's a little hope, and now you're smooshed. Go for it. Torture your characters. I fully approve of this. That's what our job is. Torture the characters. It's like being a dungeon master. Torture the players. It's great. 40k, yeah. I never actually got into 40k as a game system or the books. It's just not my setting, but I respect it. Yeah, crazy sudden plot. So that would be that would be an example of subverting expectations in a way that makes you go, "What?" Do not add a platforming element into your book unless you're writing Ready Player One, in which case I have it. Have at it. It's a metaphor that I took literally. Let's see. Let me go over my blog real quick and see if there's anything I missed. I don't think I did. Oh, I did miss something. I missed something huge. Oh my gosh. What is wrong with me? Okay, so there's a reason I keep my blog open on my second screen. One thing that you need to do in Act 3 is restate your theme. I'm not a big fan of literary analysis, honestly. I find that kind of stuff pretty tedious. I know how to do it. I did it really well in college. I understand it, but it's still pretty tedious. However, there is one thing out of all of that that I think is of severe value, and that is the uh, the fact that your book has to have a theme. The theme doesn't need to be something esoteric. It can be pretty straightforward. In the novel that I'm working on, Fallen, the theme of the book, it's already been stated, so it's not a spoiler, is my main character trying to come to grips with the fact that she is now living on Earth as opposed to in heaven. The world is different, things are scary, she doesn't really understand how humanity works, what it's like to be a person. She's trying to put all that together. That's kind of the theme of the book, is my character trying to cobble together who she is after a really major change. So that is major part of a major part of the theme. Um, in the finale of your book, this theme needs to be brought back. If you've kind of through the end of Act 2, the theme might feel like it's changed, but you need to show the contrast in the ending as opposed to the beginning. So if we're going back to Avatar: The Last Airbender because that's where I've been all day. If we look at season 1 of Avatar: The Last Airbender, in episode 1 you've got Sokka and Katara, pretty normal Southern Water Tribe kids, in so much as there's normal with a war-torn world and their parents all off to war, but their life is pretty average. And Aang he's a 12-year-old who has crazy airbending powers, but he doesn't really want to be the Avatar. He doesn't really want to do any of this stuff. He doesn't really want to have anything to do with the war. He doesn't even really know it exists yet. So he's completely ignorant and just wants to play, as you'd expect of a 12-year-old. So no judgment there. At the end of season 1, you have Katara emerging as a really powerful leader. You have Sokka becoming a pretty consummate warrior. You're also starting to see his ability with tactics and the fact that he's an inventor. And Aang is starting to realize that he can't run away from what's happening. He can't avoid it. He can't ignore it, no matter how much he might want to. And so, at the end of the first season of Avatar, you're actually entering into you're at the end of the debate. If we're going to use the beat sheet, you're at the end of the debate period of the story, and Aang is going to be taking that step into Act 2, saying, all right, I'm owning this. I am going to be the Avatar. I am going to learn these things. I've started down this path, and I'm going to keep going. So you see that big contrast. Yes, he does find a way not to kill Ozai. He takes away his bending powers, but he does fight him. So there is conflict there, and he resolves it. He doesn't end up having to kill him, and that's a really important thing with the character. I could nerd out about Avatar: The Last Airbender all day and probably most of tomorrow. But the contrast here between two reasonably normal kids and Aang wanting nothing to do with it, with the end of season 1, where Aang is more resolute. He's willing to take this challenge on, and you've got Sokka and Katara, who are no longer, in a lot of ways, they're starting to be not kids anymore. They're fighters, they're revolutionaries. They're seeing the world for the way it kind of is, and they're coming up against all these horrible things in preparation for coming up against more horrible things. So, taking season 1 out of the meta, just because the meta of the whole series, the way this series worked, and I think there are 3 layers of 3-act structure inherent in the series. There is the meta for the entire series of Aang stopping the Fire Nation from continuing their war and just ending the war. Then there's Aang mastering each element. as happens. There's each season's arc, and then each episode has a 3-act structure and uses the beat sheet. If you went through and watched each episode, you could put it down on the beat sheet and then go to the larger the season, put that on a beat sheet, which is what I did today, and then you could take the entire show and put that on the beat sheet, and it would match up beat for beat right there. You can see it, and that's what I'm going to be talking about when I get into series writing. So, but the end of the first season, it's a really satisfying ending. They've stopped the assault on the Northern Water Tribe. They prove to themselves that they can stand up to the Fire Nation, that the Fire Nation isn't this insurmountable force they'll never be able to look at or talk to. And you've got this theme of Aang having to confront the fact that he ran away. You've got this theme of redemption, sort of begun in Zuko, because at the end of season 1, Zuko more or less lets Aang go. And you have the first hints of the fact that Iroh is as good a guy as we thought he is, and he's not willing to just follow orders for the sake of following orders, because he understands the implications of what he's doing and doesn't want to destroy the world. So, like Admiral Zhao does when he kills the moon spirit. So you've got these layers. But the ending of the series with them, that big penultimate battle, that big 2-parter where they fight the Fire Nation and the Northern Water Tribe, it's satisfying. It feels good. You want to see what's going to happen next, but it feels good. They've succeeded in their goal. We've succeeded in the arc that started in the first couple of episodes. You know, they wanted to get to the Northern Water Tribe that entire time. They got there, and they were able to stop the Fire Nation from using Sozin's Comet to destroy the Northern Water Tribe. So you've done all the things, but not every door is closed. Not every thread has been tied up. There are definitely pieces, because, I mean, Zuko's still out in the world wanting to hunt him, and he hasn't stopped the Fire Lord, and there's still a lot of stuff going on, but at least the main body of that story has come to a conclusion. And you see that theme, you see the transformation of the character from the beginning to the end of that. And of course, that transformation continues in a more complete way over the whole series, but taking it into pieces. So your conclusion should state your theme and show, not tell, the difference in the characters and the setting in contrast to the way things were at the beginning. Now, there are some books where the characters don't change much, and while they might have succeeded in their goal, nothing's really different for them. So, again, I'm going back to Murder, She Wrote. I'll look at, like, Legend of Korra. I really like Legend of Korra. Don't talk shit about it. All right, most of the problems in Legend of Korra were production issues. Anyway, you've got Nancy Drew. You've got, like, the Hardy Boys, or Murder, She Wrote, or all these other series. They're actual series of books, but every guys, focus. But those series are campy mystery series. So in so much as they're a series, it's literally just, well, every book is going to be Nancy Drew solving a case, and it's just that. There's no meta. There's nothing bigger. There's none of that. There's just Nancy Drew solving a case. So book series like that are kind of on the outs these days. You could probably get away with one, particularly for younger readers, which Nancy Drew was, and particularly in, like, the cozy mystery kind of series, because some people just want to read about their favorite detective solving whatever the crime du jour is and going on about their day. That's fine. I completely understand and accept that. But in the case of most novels, you want to see some kind of actual transformation from the beginning to the end of the characters, of the story, of the setting. Like, there should be some kind of significant impact and significant difference in that space. Because if you haven't changed those things, what did you do? what did you spend 60 to 80,000 words doing if you haven't changed the way the world is set up, or at least the characters? I mean, wrote an overly long sitcom episode. There you go. Perfect. Um, if your character has absolutely zero character development of any kind whatsoever at all, they're a bad character. Period. Now, that development doesn't have to be emotional. That development might be they gain some powers. Like, okay, so let's use like an android for an example. They don't have feelings at all. We're not talking like Data. We're not talking, But if the character has no feelings, that's not a thing they do. They've learned something over the course of this, probably. So they have new data. Maybe they have the ability to do something they couldn't before. They got modified somehow. Or what have you. But there should be some kind of change or transformation in the story. Even if they aren't like, I can love now. I have feelings. Maybe they never get there. That's okay. But there should be some kind of change. Or, if you're not going to change your main character somehow, the world around them should be different. The secondary characters should have changed or been developed or evolved somehow. Or the setting should have been developed or evolved somehow. There should be some kind of change. If there's no change whatsoever, and the ending is exactly like the beginning, and you're not doing some kind of weird literary cyclical thing where you're using high literary devices to kind of create metaphors for how nothing ever really changes. You could accomplish that, sure. You definitely could. So think the ending of Harrison Bergeron, where in fact nothing changed. The character development does not have to relate directly to the theme. They just need to have a development. Villains. Okay, so hold on. Villains don't have to develop the same way. They aren't expected to. I'm talking your main character. Not every single character that the main characters ever come into contact with, including the villain, has to be different. The main character should be different than when they started on this journey. Or the characters immediately adjacent to them should also have developed and be different. That's what I'm getting at. I'm sorry if that wasn't clear. Villains are... antagonists don't necessarily have to change. Or at this point in the story, maybe they are changing, but in so much as, ooh, my methods didn't work out this time, I'm going to have to change my tactic. Things like that can be developed. Being dead is definitely a change. Being murderated counts as change. So the change may be that they're coming at it from a different angle the next time, depending on how you want to have your big baddie. So in Fallen, the meta story is going to barely be sprinkled into this, and the people who are actually the bad guys, they aren't even in this book. So they haven't changed. You haven't even met them. How would you know if they changed? Maybe they did change, and I didn't tell you. Things like that. There are obvious exceptions. Not, the barista your character meets in chapter 2 and gets a coffee from and is never mentioned again. Their life probably isn't any different unless you've leveled all of Manhattan that they're in. So, they don't need to change. And that's okay. But the main characters, the principal characters, should change. At least a little bit. And they should at least be... there should be some kind of contrast between the world as it is at the end, and the world meaning the characters and everything that they're dealing with. I don't mean like you have to change the entire setting, the entire world, but the character's world at the end should be different than the main character's world at the beginning. Because if it's not, you're writing a campy mystery story, or you've failed somewhere. So, I'm glad that I remembered to talk about that, because if I'd missed that, I would have been very annoyed with myself. So, having said that, does anybody have any questions? We have about 6 minutes left, so. And there are no stupid questions, really. So if you want to ask a question and you're feeling, oh, that's a dumb question, ask me anyway. It's okay. The only stupid question would be like, what color are your socks? Because joke's on you, I'm not wearing any.
Where does my lap go when I stand up?
Ow. My husband just asked me where his lap went when he stands up. I got 1d4 psychic damage. I don't have enough time to write to discuss how to write a satisfying ending, um, because we have 5 minutes, and that would be kind of more than a 5 minute discussion, I think. Writing a satisfying ending, ultimately, it's about using the things that you set up, taking the dominoes that you've been placing throughout the whole story, and making sure that all of the ones that are pertinent to the main story have been knocked down when you start the climax. So you have that fall where you've used the things that you've been setting up. If you set things up and don't use them, they're not going to be satisfied. That's the smallest soundbite I can give you out of that. Well, right, Anagram. That's the thing is we know, a lot of us, we know the way this structure works. It's in here because we've spent our lives reading, watching TV, playing video games, watching movies, consuming media of all kinds. Right, fire Chekhov's gun. Exactly. We've been consuming all this media our entire lives. And, I'm 35, so I've been doing it a hot minute. All of these systems are in my brain, but I didn't really think about, I didn't enumerate exactly what it was. But we still have these patterns and these structures we follow even without realizing it. And that's honestly part of the power of storytelling. We've been doing this since the dawn of time. You go back to read the Iliad and the Odyssey, you'll see shades of this. It's different because those are epic poems, so it's a little different, but you'll see shades of the structures we use now. And you don't need to have a big twist. The what a twist moment isn't necessary. Having a huge kind of twist isn't necessary. Subverting expectations can be done in smaller ways and still be satisfying. So you don't need to have the main character having been dead the entire movie. You don't need to have that degree of like, what a twist kind of moment in order for it to work. Yes, if a car falls down, it must explode, no exceptions. Also, you every time you pick up a gun, it needs to make the cocking noise, like even though I didn't. Every time you pick up a semi-auto, you have to cock it, even though, or not cock. You have to chamber around, even if there's probably a round chambered. Every time, without fail. I have opinions on the way weapons are used in movies. Yep, bullets are infinite unless plot. Well, right, Anagram. You've been dropping these little breadcrumbs like it's a bad idea the entire time, and you're giving them what you told them you were gonna give them. They just maybe didn't pick up on it, or if they did pick up on it, they're like, well, we were told. Like a blam. Yeah, there we go. Perfect. Oh, another one. Snipers always have active laser sights on their rifles. Always. Unless they're the main character, in which case they don't. Active laser sights. I have opinions about active laser sights. The panda knows. It absolutely does negate the point of a sniper, and active lasers are useless after a certain range. Absolutely useless because there are so many things that affect the way a sniper's bullet hits. Like, at a certain distance, the literal curvature of the Earth comes into play. Then you have crosswinds, and you have spin drift, and you have gravity, and all these other things that, anyway, sorry, my brain will explode. Like I said, I have feelings. And any firearms enthusiast worth their salt is going to tell you an active laser is worthless. There you go, perfect. Yes, predictive laser. We're getting into the ultra sci-fi now. Um, well, that's what using a beat sheet and structure is for. It'll help you figure out how all the pieces are going to sit until you're ready to knock them all down and pick them up again. So if you're finding out that you're struggling with it, outline. Even if while you're writing things change, outline. All right, it is 7 p.m. I need to eat. Is there any last real quick things that anybody wants to say before we take off? As I told everybody at the beginning of this, I will not be here next week. I love you too, sweetie. I will not be here next week because I am traveling to deal with a surprise plumbing issue at my family's summer property, so that's fun. But it'll be a nice trip. I won't have internet, otherwise I'd be, on with you guys. But there's no internet where we are, and there's no cell phone signal, so I can't even call in. Have a good night, guys. Always a pleasure.